Before the birth of the universe, there was a being known as the One Great. The Greater Will, an entity that represents its mind, caused this great being to split in two in an event that parallels the Big Bang. And from this rupture, all things came to be. The One Great was divided into two cosmic entities, who together encompassed the whole of the universe. The Greater Will remained an autonomous entity, however. The Ice and Night cosmic entity stands for the universal laws of flow and stagnation. Its purest aspects are the primeval current, which is the stream of celestial entities such as stars, represented by ultramarine blue, and comets, represented by turquoise, and which, microcosmically, is manifested by the flow of water. The moons and ice are related to this aspect of the cosmic entity as well. And shadow and the void of space, which is the darkness glimpsed by Azure. The pure essence of the Ice and Night cosmic entity is represented by the colors blue and black, and it is associated with mind, intelligence, and dexterity. The Fire and Day cosmic entity stands for the forces of creation and destruction. Its purest aspects are fire, the most destructive of all elements. In its purest form, it is represented by vermilion, and light, the most creative of all elements. Dim light is represented by white, while gleaming light by bright yellow. The pure essence of the Fire and Day cosmic entity is represented by the colors red and white, and it is associated with vigor, faith, and strength. Various elements and laws of nature result from the combination of the essence of the cosmic entities, such as the flow of the wind, in combination with the principle of strength, becomes the storm. The flow of electricity, in combination with light, becomes lightning. Should one increase the proportion of the Fire and Day cosmic entity's flame aspect in its formula, it becomes red lightning, and vice versa for cold lightning. Gravity and its flowing electric waves of push and pull. Gravity is manifested as a purple-colored force for its interaction with solid mass, the principle of strength. Rot, which is derived from the principle of stagnation paired with the creative forces of life, and is portrayed with vibrant orange, scarlet, and pink colors. Sleep, a force that is represented by light purple, and can be manifested as both a mist and a flame. Eternal sleep is of a deeper shade. The Frenzied flame, which is a heavy, flowing flame with a dark interior. The Frenzied flame seal exemplifies the mixed nature of this element. It scales majorly with faith, but it also benefits from intelligence, strength, and dexterity. By applying color theory, it is possible to precisely discern the amount of influence of each aspect of the cosmic entities that is present anywhere in Elden Ring. And to conclude the explanation for the stats of Elden Ring, Endurance and Arcane are associated with both cosmic entities. The Fractured One Great in this sense is both a dualistic entity and a trinity, with the Greater Will, which is its mind, being the third part. The One Great parallels the Gnostic Demiurge, a flawed creator god who harvests the life energy of the living. As I have explained, various components of the universe result from the combination of the aspects of the cosmic entities, and they are sometimes referred to as outer gods. Named examples include the Formless Mother and the Outer God of Rot. To be clear, the outer gods of Elden Ring are akin to amoral forces of nature. Their drive is merely that of the elements they embody. For example, the Formless Mother, which represents blood, craves wounds. The Outer God of Rot, appropriately, seeks to spread rot, and so on. To close this section, I want to highlight that George R. R. Martin has written other Gnostic narratives in the past. I have proposed in this channel that A Song of Ice and Fire, George's masterpiece, is one of them, in fact. The main narrative of that book series involves humanity producing a god-emperor who becomes a vassal of the Demiurge and conquers the entire world to establish an empire. Mankind then must plan a conspiracy to destroy the Antichrist, that is, the Azorahai, the God Emperor, and purge his demigod bloodline, getting rid of the Demiurge's influence, eradicating pagan god worship, and creating a proto-atheistic society. For a more blatant example, George's novella Sand Kings is a direct allegory to mankind fighting the Demiurge. The plot of the novella goes like this. A wealthy and psychopathic man named Simon Crass is obsessed with collecting dangerous and exotic animals. He eventually comes across a mysterious pet shop and buys a terrarium filled with 4 colonies of creatures called Sand Kings. Crass watches as his 4 colonies, colored white, black, red and orange, begin to build their castles, but quickly becomes bored. He begins to starve them to provoke wars among the 4 factions, and after that, they consistently wage wars over the food he provides them with. He also projects a hologram of his face, prompting them to worship him as a god and decorate their structures in his image. The story ends with the Sand Kings rebelling and killing Crass. Of course, Crass represents the Demiurge, and the Sand Kings represent humanity. And as I will prove in this video, Elden Ring's narrative is very similar to these novellas. During prehistoric times, a shooting star landed in the center of the world. Its impact caused the sea levels to rise, and the then united continents to fracture. The land surrounding the area where the collision took place would later earn the name Lands Between for this very reason. It became the isolated nucleus of the planet. This shooting star harbored a gleaming daughter of the Greater Will, Matir. She was tasked by the Greater Will to carry out a process of colonization, the operation's goal being to harvest the life energy of its inhabitants. Matir would give birth to the Fingers, who, like herself, acted as oracles of the Greater Will and were tasked with shepherding the creatures of the Lands Between. She was host to the Elden Ring, and her quest would culminate in her bequeathing it to a god emperor native to this world, as well as in the planting of energy-absorbing sacred trees. This process of colonization was accomplished in countless other planets, as hinted by the cosmic realm where the Elden Beast resides. The inhabitants of the Lands Between were simple creatures, unfit to worship and serve the Greater Will. Under the guidance of the Greater Will, Matir would grant them intelligence, which would, in turn, reshape their biology, and so, they developed hands with 5 fingers. With their novel enlightenment, they would commune with the elements and forces that surrounded them. The creatures of the Lands Between operated under a law of might. The strongest would earn the right to rule. The stronger one was, the higher one would ascend in the ranks of their respective species. This ideology was intrinsic to their character. They valued toughness and yielded to might. The dragons, who originate from the Jagged Peak, would master the arts of the storm and red lightning, both being forms of magic which embody aspects of the 2 cosmic entities. Through their communion, they developed stone scales, which granted them a form of immortality due to the scale's ability to defy time itself. With their newfound power, they would go on to conquer the entirety of the Lands Between. The enemies which they defeated, the beasts, the hawks and the Demi-humans, would be incorporated into their rule. As they had proved their strength to the dragons, a bond of friendship and servitude was formed between them. The beasts are mainly associated with the Fire and Day cosmic entity. Their weapons, which all scale predominantly with strength, exhibit ornate patterns that portray a facet of that cosmic entity. The bestial incantations scale with both faith and strength. The hawks are mostly associated with the Ice and Night cosmic entity, and their abilities scale with quality, a combination of strength and dexterity, as they dance around the air and summon powerful storms. The Demi-humans are worshippers of the stars. However, they too have an affinity with strength. Sometime during this epoch, man would arrive at the Lands Between, These ancient men were the Numen, hunter-gatherer cavemen who hid below the ground to avoid the hostile creatures of the surface. They knew that the horns of a long-lived beast continued to bud like antlers over and over again, until the beast one day becomes an ancestral spirit. Their culture was shaped around this knowledge, and they communed harmoniously with the nature around them. They would wear horns on their heads in a symbolic portrayal of their creed. Their customs aimed to emancipate life itself. They would brew the spirits of animals to give rise to greater beings with extended lifespans. When these great beings died, the Numen and the nature around them would absorb their energy. This is why both the Numen and the ancestor spirits are undead. Their forms are the outcome of these practices. And this is also why they disdained metals, which are conductive materials, prone to absorbing souls. As part of this set of practices, they buried their dead to fertilize their soil. This imbued the trees that grew from it with their souls. As a result, their trees would produce enchanted golden sap, which the Numen consumes to inherit the concentrated life energy within it. This would, in turn, grant them a unique quality, the property of a conductor, and their hair would acquire a faint golden hue, like the leaves of the trees which they revered and cultivated. Their life-absorbing practices are expressed by two of their ceremonial weapons, one that, in the presence of death, would absorb the vigor of the fallen, and another that would absorb the mana. The Numen have also created various talismans that ward off the influence of outer gods, which is reflected in them, preventing status effects from building up. All men would descend from the Numen, who were akin to a primordial ancestor of humanity. The groups of men who drifted away from their Numen roots would at some point stop identifying with the label. The primordial tribe of Numen who first settled in the underworld of the lands between and kept their customs would later be known as the ancestral followers. The migrations of the Numen, which led to the birth of a diversified humanity, were inspired by the mainstream out of Africa theory of paleoanthropology. It's interesting to note that men were not the only creatures to consume this special golden sap. Rune bears are often seen scraping golden trees for their sap, and that explains their immense size and strength. The Shamans were a matriarchal tribe of Numen who migrated to the surface in small numbers. They maintained and expanded upon the cultural habits of their predecessors, which would result in their hair acquiring a stronger golden hue. Their culture would earn them the title of Shamans. They would be branded as such by a foreign people they would interact with in distant times. Their story serves as a microcosm for an age that would come in the far, far future. One day, a tribe of Numen would split from the main group and settle near the volcano of Mount Gilmer in the northwest. There, they would commune with Bayle, a serpent's deity, and master the arts of magma. They developed the art of metallurgy, and began to employ bronze tools and weaponry. They also developed the habit of consuming human flesh to gradually grow in size, some reaching titanic proportions. Their cannibalistic practices were a reflection of the demands of the Serpent, Bayle, who they treated with offerings of human flesh. This phenomenon explains why the crows and dogs that feasted on human remains, all of them found on battlefields, have grown exponentially. The aspect of the cosmic entity they worshipped was physically manifested within their bellies, attaching itself to their guts. Whenever they ate, they also fed it with blood offerings. Such cannibalistic practices resulted in their hair turning red. This tribe would become known as the Fire Giants. They were infected with a parasite provided to them by the Serpent's deity. These parasites were akin to roundworms, consuming a part of what their hosts ate. As the face of their god was removed from the bellies of the trolls by the Golden Order in the distant future, their guts were extracted along with it. That was done to ensure the removal of the parasites from their intestines. Eventually, the fire giants would want to migrate to the mountaintops, as there they'd be closer to the cosmos. Upon reaching their destination, they would face the ice dragons, who were the lords of that territory, and the slave warriors of Zamor. The fire giants would earn a decisive victory, and the ice dragons were chased from the peak. At the mountaintops, the fire giants would intensify their communion with the cosmos. They built an enormous kiln at the tallest mountain. The giants also had an affinity with blood, a red, hot liquid, with many of them being proficient in aberrant sorceries. Blood is an element adjacent to fire, and the blood star is situated near the polar star. This is why we see plenty of aberrant sorcerers worshipping their god, alongside fire monks, and why the frozen corpses of the giants who died in combat are impaled with trident-like, spiky wooden staves. One day, a seafaring people, the astrologers, reached the lands between. Their homeland faced a catastrophic flood, and so they sealed themselves and their animals away within gigantic stone coffins and let the currents guide their way. Their coffins washed up on the eastern shores of the lands between, but they had to migrate to the west to avoid the dragons, which hailed from the jagged peak. The astrologers were expert swordsmen who studied the stars. In fact, it was from their astrological studies that they garnered the inspiration to develop their swordsmanship. They also conducted boat funerals as a way of offering their dead to the currents. They founded their own civilization in the west, most of its territory being located underground. The astrologers were the distant predecessors of the ascetic swordsmen of Eocade, and of the Nox, Carians, and Liurnians, and their original leader, a man named Ul, would spawn a dynastic bloodline. The astrologers would make contacts with the natives of the lands between, and learn their tree cultivating practices. The engraved stones of the ancestral followers depict the astrologers coming by sea and learning from them. Later during this age, the astrologers would occasionally clash with the creatures of the surface. For each skirmish they won, a fort was built. Most notably, they constructed the Stormveil Castle upon the defeat of the Stormhawks. Slowly but steadily, mankind was making a mark for itself and conquering territory throughout the lands between. The astrologers created the Claymen, lead-based primitive homunculi who serve as soldiers and oracles. In the underworld, they planted a sacred tree, which they would cultivate over the ages to come, that being the Great Tree. Eventually, the astrologers would want to migrate to the mountaintops, as there they'd be closer to the cosmos. As they settled there, they'd make contact with the fire giants, who they began to see as their neighbors, and develop an alliance with them. At the mountaintops, the astrologers would intensify their communion with the cosmos, like the fire giants had done before them. They would build a rise to study the stars from the peaks and glimpse the primeval current, and from this glimpse, the astrologers founded the art of glintstone sorcery. Other rises were built throughout their territories following the event. In the rises, they would study not only the primeval current as it dictated the motions of the stars in outer space, but also its microcosmic manifestations. They examined seashells and rocks. They also constructed hourglasses and models of globes to study the flow of time and the rotation of celestial bodies. Falling stars often crashed upon the lands between. Some house meteoric ores, as well as the falling star beasts, ant-lion-like creatures, some of which would mature and become astal, which are lacewing-like, and the onyx and alabaster lords. Others house glintstone crystals and the crystallians, beings who safeguard the crystals of their stars. The descendants of the astrologers would build various mines, employing laborers to extract smithing stones, meteor ores, and glintstone from caves which hid broken stars. Within the mines, they discovered these alien beings and later commune with them. The descendants of the astrologers would also build advanced machines, such as the four-armed puppets and the fire chariots, which depicted the fire giants as fearsome monsters to evoke dread on the comparatively simple-minded beasts. Artifacts such as the black leather shield, a shield that is obtained at the Carian Manor, which depicts the polar star under a night sky, and the sword of night and flame, can also be dated to have been crafted around this time, and represents the friendship of the giants and the astrologers. Some of the descendants of the astrologers would converse their communion and become the fire monks. The fire prelates imitated the cannibalistic practices of the giants, though they lacked the parasite of their god within their guts, which is why they have become bloated. It is for this reason that their design is reminiscent of Smough, the iconic fat cannibal of Dark Souls. At the mountaintops, the astrologers had met the twin birds, and so discovers the ghost flame. They developed the cultural habit of cremating their dead as a means of offering their deaths to the twin birds, and their descendants built vast underground catacombs to conduct their cremation rituals in. The bodies of their deceased would be placed in stone coffins, which were guided through underground rivers to the catacombs to be cremated by ghost flame as offerings to the twin bird. Most importantly, the ashes of their dead would fertilize the great tree. This age was one of steadfast civilizational progress for mankind. With their new knowledge and tools, they'd vastly expand their domain over the lands between. Many of the structures we find in the lands between were built during this epoch by this joint civilization, such as the enormous aqueducts and bridges and the Divine Towers. The Divine Towers, like many of these structures, were constructed with meteoric rock. Their elevators were engraved with a pattern that references the polar star. Their peaks were also made on the polar star's image. There's the pupil on the middle, surrounded by 8 circles. They also feature plenty of great tree symbolism, a recurring theme in the architecture of this period. The underground forges were also built around this time. Within these forges, stone golems were brought to life and would forge the smith-script weapons, as well as enormous dragon-slaying arrowheads. The descendants of the astrologers expanded their underground capitals, forming the Eternal Cities. There they'd create the Dragonkin soldiers, Frankenstein's monsters-like creatures, created by merging dragon and giant remains. They were capable of wielding frozen lightning, a variation, or perhaps an imitation of the lightning of the dragons that arose due to the elements that surrounded them. The descendants of the astrologers began to secretly cultivate a falling star beast, sending some of the stone coffins containing their dead downstream to feed it, as opposed to cremating them in ghost flame. This initiative would backfire, and the resulting Astel would pose a threat to the Eternal Cities, and so the Grand Cloister was sealed to contain it. The walls that rose acted as a dam, and the flow of water was stopped. This caused an outbreak of rot, and those who were near the cloister were afflicted with the ailment. A swordsman, which had been turned blind from the affliction, had an epiphany as he heard the flow of the underground rivers, which evokes the image of a blue, dancing fairy. To defeat the rot, he would have to become a dancer himself. A group of men was abducted by demi-humans near Siofre and became the Fallen Hawk company of slave soldiers. The men of the Fallen Hawk were ordered to scout and prowl the Eternal Cities. This is what the inverted hawk sigil represents. They are inverted hawks for they dive below the earth. Their journey would finally lead them to their destination, but by then the band's last embers faltered, and they began to burn the bones of their fellows, acquiring the cold ghost flame, but sealing their fate as dwellers of the underground for eternity. Having acquired newfound strength, the fire giants and the descendants of the astrologers would end the prolonged war against the dragons, who at this point had been mostly contained to the jagged peak and its surroundings. The final battle took place at the north of the region that would later be known as Caelid. This battle resulted in a resounding victory for mankind. As the dragons and their subjects were impressed by the strength man had attained, A deep friendship between them was born. Farum Azula would be built on top of the main battlefield of the war to host the remains of the fallen. At its highest point, a great ritual to produce a god would be performed, using the deaths that were buried there as offerings. Placidusax would become the alchemical Ribis, the first Elden Lord of the Lands Between and vassal of the Elden Ring. He would later split a part of his anima from himself, which became Florisax. Florisax is the manifestation of the first of Placidusax's heads that detached from his body, which is why the Old Lord's talisman depicts him with only 4. And so, a great empire was born, one that encompassed the entirety of the Lands Between. The Great Tree would reach maturity, and mankind would rule over the eclipse, which amplifies the connection of the spiritual realm with the physical, and symbolized the union of night and flame. This is what the empty circle symbol, which is seen all throughout the Lands Between, represents: the drained sun of the eclipse. The symbol of the winged serpent, which stands for the fusion of the two cosmic entities, is also illustrative of this alliance. Structures such as Castle Ensis, the Shadow Keep, Raya Lucaria, the Volcano Manor, and others can be dated to have been built during this period. The descendants of the astrologers would carry out a series of experiments to produce homunculi that would serve them as soldiers, oracles, and servants. From the dew of the Great Tree, they created the Albinorics. Over the age of the eclipse, 3 generations of Albinorics were designed, each with its own alchemical composition, which is analogous to an alloy. Every generation of Albinorics shares a mass-produced, homogeneous appearance among them, apart from their sexual dimorphism. The first generation is composed of the female wolf riders, like Latenna, who likely served as sentinels and soldiers, and of the males like Albos, who served as priests. The legs of the first generation Albinorics are fated to wilt over time. This generation represents blue-silver. The second generation represents a platinum alloy. Platinum alloys are harder and more lightweight than platinum alone. This property can be observed by the flipping maneuvers of the males, who served as soldiers. The females of this generation were employed as finger readers, serving as oracles. The third generation is composed of the oracle envoys. These oracles would prophesy the coming of a new age, an age of gold. They would play their trumpets, golden horns that scale with faith and strength and are decorated with the helix symbol, to welcome the dawn, which is also symbolized by their white attires. They possibly represent the electrum alloy. As mankind was made aware of the new age that was fated to come, they wanted to plant a new divine tree and produce a new host to the Elden Ring. A seed was grafted onto a root of the great tree. They would fertilize this seed with animal sacrifice, and it emanated some of the life energy it absorbed back at them. This exchange would cause horns to sprout on their bodies, earning them the name Hornsent. For the purpose of producing a new host to the Elden Ring, the Hornsent carried out brutal inquisitions to hunt the Shamans, excusing their actions under the guise of justice. The Shamans they captured and imprisoned were chopped to pieces and stuffed into jars with the objective of brewing a saint, a being with a concentrated, charged body who'd inherit enhanced conductive properties. Only 2 saints were successfully produced. One of them was Romina. She'd commune with an aspect of the outer god of rot and blast metals, which were imbued with the aspect of stagnation, and thus turned into verdigris, the most protective of all metals. A church was built in dedication to her, and statues were sculpted in her image. As the Inquisition followed its course, Enir Eilim, a spiraling tower that aims to reach the heavens, was being constructed. The Empire of the Eclipse had envisioned to produce a god atop it. When Enir Eilim was finished, they began to stack the jumbled corpses of failed saints to build the Gate of Divinity, a portal filled by their special souls. They were bound with ropes in the shape of the Rune of Life. There are two layers of corpses that compose the Gates of Divinity. The first layer is bound by ropes and is formed of jumbled corpses of failed saints, which came from jars, and the second layer is composed of flayed Hornsent bodies. These will be elaborated upon later. They selected a saint to conduct a ritual at its peak, a ritual that would birth a god. The chosen saint was a girl named Marika, who used to be the youngest of the Shamans. Through this ritual, she would attain an Empyrean body, that is, a body with supreme conductivity, and be transplanted the Elden Ring, becoming the alchemical Rebis, a being who embodies both male and female natures and is empowered by a metaphorical dragon, which, in this case, is represented by the Elden Beast, which is the Elden Ring itself. Despite the sacredness of this ritual, it would also be viewed by many as the original sin. Upon becoming a god, Marika plucked the Rune of Death from the Elden Ring, creating the Golden Order, an event which marks the birth of a new age, an age of life, which she would rule as a god emperor. The sacred seed that was planted by the Hornsent grew. This sapling would be known as the Crucible, the primordial form of the Earth Tree. This process is masterfully depicted by the Crucible tree set. The Grace Tree, portrayed as a silver, intertwining tree standing on a dark background, is situated below the chest piece, which is depicting the root trunk of the Crucible seen from above. The helmet depicts the sprouting of the Crucible. As the Crucible grew, it emanated some of the life energy it had been fertilized with. The corpses of animals and men that were buried in the underworld would serve to fertilize the Earth Tree. All life would blend together to feed it. This is why men mutated into chimeric beings upon interacting with the Crucible. They would absorb the life energy of various creatures, and their shape would be altered by it. These interactions were then considered blessings, and chimeric features a sign of divinity. The Grace Tree began to be filled with golden sap, as its roots were connected to the Earth Tree. Leyndell was built around the growing body of the Earth Tree to be the new capital of the Lands Between, safeguarding the Earth Tree within its walls. The Hornsent built the Colosseums to host a great gladiatorial competition, with the goal of finding a suitable champion to become Marika's consort and Elden Lord. In the arenas, warriors would fight beasts to prove their might to Marika. All of the peoples of the Lands Between were invited, and the Highlanders, a tribe of berserker warriors whose customs involved hunting mighty beasts for glory, were quick to earn praise. As an aside, the Highlands at this point in time were part of the Lands Between. It was a snowy, mountainous region, similar to the mountaintops, and it was connected to the consecrated snowfield. Bears were seen as a particularly noteworthy opponent by the Highlanders, and it is in the consecrated snowfield area where we find the highest concentration of them. The white favor of the headbands and leather crowns worn by Highlander warriors, which represents their home settlement, is symbolic of snow. As more and more falling stars rained upon the Lands Between, earthquakes deformed the land mass, and the sea level rose, and so its geographic ties to surrounding lands were lost. Horelu, the chieftain of the Highlands, bested Zerosh, the Lord of the Beasts, earning him the rise to the crown. But before his coronation he would have to pass one final test. Horelu was ordered to abdicate his past and his very identity. He'd walk through a triumphal arc and consume the golden sap, without any sign of wavering. This ritual finally established him as Elden Lord, and he'd be renamed as Godfrey. Zerosh, who had been impressed with his strength, would become his regent and advisor, and would pledge to suppress his bloodlust so that he could adequately fulfill his vow. The union of Marika and Godfrey would produce a lineage of demigods, the Golden lineage, its firstborn being Godwyn the Golden. The Highlander warriors of Godfrey's tribe who had proven their strength in the Colosseums were granted knighthood. Some of them would become Divine Beast Knights. Some of them would become Inquisitors under the Order of the Black Knights, and those closest to Godfrey became the Crucible Knights. Most of the other Highlander warriors were incorporated into the army as soldiers. This is why Messmer's soldiers, which belongs to the army of this empire, fight similarly to Godfrey, stomping the ground and howling like barbarians. Thus, the Round Table Hold was assembled. The statues that encircle the Round Table Hold depicts the Crucible, the Earth Tree sapling form. Godfrey, along with his knights, would solemnly swear to safeguard the Earth Tree. The age that ensued was one of conquest in the name of the Golden Order. As it fundamentally alters the world, it provoked a great deal of animosity. The once united empire of the Eclipse began to fracture. Marika would order Godfrey to lead the Crucible army in a war against the Fire Giants. The Trolls, giants who had the practice of eating tree roots, which earns them their distinct appearance, joined the forces of the Golden Order in battle. They'd have the omen of their god, the face which grew on their bellies, removed from their bodies. Marika fought in this war as Radagon, a mysterious champion of the Earth Tree. He would lead the beings that would later be called Misbegotten in the Crusade. Radagon's heroic role in this war would turn him into a figure of worship for the Misbegotten. As a result of this war, the Giant's flame was confined atop a great mountain, and the aspect of the cosmic entity which they represented was felled. This war marks the end of the Crucible era, which gave rise to the Age of the Earth Tree. As the flame of the Giants represented an intrinsic element of nature, it was impossible to kill. Marika sealed it away, cursing a lone Fire Giant survivor to perpetually tend to it. Fire Monks and Flame Guardians were appointed to watch over it, but would later succumb to its allure. As Marika cursed the Fire Giant, she'd be cursed back. Her male half, Radagon, would inherit the red hair of the Giants. At the Colosseums, spectacles mocking the Fire Giants began to take place. The gladiators wore bronze armor that depicted the Serpent, the fell god of the Fire Giants, and audiences would delight in seeing them beaten and battered. During Godfrey's absence, Marika would secretly produce Empyrean offspring with Radagon, Messmer and Melina. Messmer's birth was seen as an immaculate conception. This event was depicted by the statue of Marika that is present in Messmer's chamber, and later by the design of the abductor virgins, machines created by Reichert in homage to his elder stepbrother. Messmer would be raised among the nobility and was profoundly cherished by the Hornsent. All of the Empyreans are the offspring of Marika and Radagon, which is why they have fully inherited Marika's conductivity, and why they are chosen by the Fingers and have the birthright to succeed her. Their extraordinary conductivity is also what causes their proclivity to be consumed by outer gods. The curses they suffer from are a result of this interaction between their conductive bodies and the forces of nature that are embodied by outer gods. Melina suffered with a rot affliction, for her body was a conduit for the outer god of rot. In direct contrast to Melina, Ranni's fate was tied to the stars, for her body was a conduit for the primeval current. Messmer was fated to be subsumed by the abyssal serpent. Melina was doomed to be destroyed by Destin's death, for her body was a conduit for the forces of the dusk. And in direct contrast to Melina, Miquella was cursed with eternal youth. Melina, the second Empyrean child of Marika and Radagon, was born at the foot of the Earth Tree, at the place that would have its name erased from history in the distant future, and thus is only known as Nameless Eternal City. After Marika had imparted her with a duty, she abandoned her, leaving her without a mother. Melina would be raised among the nobility of the Eternal Cities, and her status as an Empyrean would earn her prestige and a pair of fingers. During this age, the descendants of the astrologers would produce 4 more generations of albinorics. Unlike their predecessors, these albinorics are not pale-blooded, for the silver dew of the grace tree was mixed with a higher proportion of gold and other metals. The 4th generation of albinorics is composed of the 3 sentinels, their name being self-explanatory as to their device role. Their legs are not functional, and they are permanently chained to their horses. There are two eccentric members of this generation, Gaius and Loretta, who is the sole female. The fifth generation is composed of the masons and sculptors that built the various churches of the lands between. They all have pale skin, white hair, and their bodies are of slender constitution. They were later involved in the Shabriri incident. The sixth generation is composed of the physic chemists, who later became the depraved perfumers. They acted as priests of the Earth Tree, and would collect blessed saps from basins, which were placed at the foot of minor Earth Trees and other locations throughout the lands between. The Albinarics of this generation were created by Gideon Ofnir. The seventh generation nearly perfected the homunculus formula. The Albinarics of this batch are nearly indistinguishable from regular humans. However, they still share traits with their predecessors, such as white hair, sickly constitution, and a mass-produced appearance, as hinted by the Marai's mask, a silver-looking mask which increases arcane. They served as executioners and castellans of the Shaded Castle, and were granted their own noble house, House Marais. Tiolier and Tanith are other notable Albinarics of this generation. The descendants of the astrologers would conspire against the Golden Order and produce the Silver Tears, an amalgam whose main purpose was to take the shape of Marika and usurp her to become a lord for its creators. Their creation was seen as a treasonous act of rebellion and triggered the Liurnian Wars. Marika had devised a strategy to conquer her enemies. She'd reintroduce Radagon, the mysterious champion of the Earth Tree, to the world. He would once again earn glory and meet Rennala, the Queen of Caria, in battle. And to end the conflict, Marika would arrange a political marriage between her male half and the Queen of Caria, with Radagon repenting for the Golden Order's aggression, bathing himself in celestial dew, and swearing his love for her. This plan was a resounding success, and the great houses of the Earth Tree and the Moon were joined. The union of Radagon and Rennala would produce two sons, Rykard and Radan, and, allegedly, one Empyrean daughter, Ranni. However, she too was secretly a bastard, a daughter to Radagon and Marika. She is not just the only children of Rennala born Empyrean, but also the only one to have orange hair. Rykard's hair was a muddy brown, and Radan inherited his father's flaming red. In fact, Ranni's original hair color fits perfectly in the middle of Messmer's and Malenia's red hair, and Miquella's golden blonde hair. All of Marika's children with Radagon were born Empyreans, and all of Marika's and Radagon's children with other consorts were not. The very title of the Cuckoo Order of Knights hints at Ranni being a bastard. Cuckoos are birds that place their eggs on other birds' nests, and their offspring is raised by the mother of the other species. Ranni's birth was kept a secret, and she was raised as Rennala's daughter. Rennala loved Radagon with all her heart. She loved him so much as to spiral into depression and madness upon their separation. It's entirely in character for her to raise one of Radagon's bastards as her own. She is the mother bird in the cuckoo metaphor, which is why she is connected to egg and nest symbolism. Around this time, the ancient dragons, who wielded the power of red lightning, and the hawks, who wielded the power of the storm, were instigated by Bayle, the son of Dragon Lord Placidusax, to rebel against the Golden Order. Bayle wanted to restore the dragon's hegemony and purge the mankind who overcame them, and usurps their rule. This act would earn him his infamous title of Tyrant. With the intent of burning the Earth Tree, Bayle developed Flame Lightning, an evolution of Red Lightning, which incorporated more of the flame aspect of the fire and day cosmic entity. Gransax, the Stormlord, assaulted Leyndell, the capital city of the Earth Tree, and was defeated by Godfrey. Fortisax, one of the champions of the ancient dragons, was defeated by Godwyn. Lanciax, sister of Fortisax, was defeated by Vyke, a brave knight of the Round Table. Nefeli Lu defeated her own companion Hawk, who had betrayed her, the Stormhawk King, and conquered Stormvale. Bayle attacked his father Placidusax, a devout follower of the Greater Will. While both were left gravely injured, with Placidusax losing 2 of his heads, their clash would result in Bayle's defeat, and he was forced to flee to the Jagged Peak. Bayle's bloodline would be cursed by the Greater Will. As punishment for their treason, they'd lose their arms and hands, which were granted to them in prehistoric times and are a sign of intelligence, turning them into drakes. They were stripped of their enlightenment, and thus they lost their stone scales. Their stone scales were obtained through deep communion, which they were not capable of achieving with their lesser forms. The drakes would fly around the lands between, terrorizing men wherever they went. Following the war's end, Florisax, Placidusax's consort, a part of his anima and Bayle's mother, would sacrifice her dragon form for feeble flesh to aid in the destruction of Bayle and his bloodline. Florisax would spread the dragon communion, a covenant of drake hunters who ate the hearts of their prey to absorb their strength, some of them mutating into the magma worms. All throughout Bayle's lair, there are flowers that evoke her, and her feelings of grief and motherly love for her son, despite his transgressions. Her name, Florisax, and her weapon, the Flowerstone Gavel, are symbolic of flowers. Bayle's story parallels that of Lucifer, a proud, short-sighted angel who challenged God and lost his grace. Bayle's bloodline represents the fallen angels that followed Lucifer and became demons after they were spurned from the heavens. The defeated ancient dragons were impressed by man's strength in accordance with their ideology of the rule of might, and thus would develop a bond with them. History repeats itself once again. From the friendship of man and dragon, the ancient dragon cult was founded. The ancient dragons would impart man with their knowledge of the arts of lightning. Godwyn and Vike were some of the figures who championed the cult. As consequence for their treason, the hawks had their wings chained together, impairing their flight. After the war against the dragons had ended, the golden hue faded from the eyes of Godfrey and his company of warriors. They were instructed by Marika to leave the lands between and wage war in a land far away, where they would live and die. This marks them as tarnished, warriors whose grace of gold was divested. As the Crucible army stood outside their homeland, Marika seized the opportunity to betray the Hornsent for their sins against her people. She would order Messmer to oversee an expensive crusade against them and burn the great tree with his abyssal flame. Messmer's betrayal was particularly tragic and unexpected by the Hornsent, as he was a revered figure, second only to Marika herself, a golden child beloved by all. The cherished result of Immaculate Conception brought forth the end of the Hornsent Empire. Rykard would collaborate with Messmer in his Inquisition. As a prodigal scholar and inventor, he has designed both the Abductor versions and the Furnace Golems, which are animated through a hex. Rykard's Serpent, Eagley, would be slain by a hero who wields the Serpent Hunter, a weapon that conjures the precise elemental formula to counter it. However, Eagley was immortal and would rise again from its corpse, shedding its skin in the process. The ancient Rau ruins in Romina's Church of the Bud were burned and ruined. Following their collapse, the Rau ruins would be flooded with flowing water, and the Church of the Bud with stagnant water, which festered rot. Romina herself would be felled in the Inquisition, but would blossom with rot and be reborn in a beautiful but grotesque form. After Messmer was done fulfilling his role, his powers, which threatened to subsume him, were sealed. Both of his eyes were removed, and a mark of grace was stored into his right eye socket. Marika would pile innumerable corpses of the Hornsent at the Gate of Divinity atop Enir Eilim, and employed their souls to conduct a ritual that would engulf the epicenter of their civilization in shadow for eternity. The threads of gold Marika wields in the story trailer were taken from a pile of flayed skin. Runes are stored within one's heart, and from it, they flow through the body. Marika had flayed the Hornsents to extract their souls, which is why the bodies are gory red flesh. As a result of the Great Purge of the Hornsent, which ended with Messmer being sealed in the Land of Shadow, Rykard would take his stepbrother's place as head Inquisitor. Unlike Messmer, he was not an Empyrean, and Eagle had not yet managed to dominate him, and so he was not considered a threat to the Golden Order. Those who were blessed by the Crucible and revered for their divinity would become known as misbegotten and be spurned from the Golden Order. Most of them ended up as slaves. Through the roots of the Earth Tree, which are intermingled with those of the Grace Tree, the vengeful spirits of the Hornsent began to possess those who were born in the lands between, and haunt them in their nightmares. Those who were cursed would be called Omen, and be persecuted by the Golden Order. Those of low birth were exorcised through the removal of their horns, a rite which often killed them. The scions of Leyndell who were born afflicted with the curse were confined to the sewers of the capital and forced to live in hiding, bounded by magic shackles for eternity. Some of the Omen would be employed as soldiers of the Golden Order, but preparations were taken to ensure they'd not be a threat. The last of Marika's offspring with Godfrey, the twins Morgoth and Mohg, were ironically born as Omen. Godfrey had impregnated her before his exile. He'd only see Morgoth within Marika's belly, and as a corpse. Godfrey's exile led to the Long March, a journey where the Tarnished travelled from Leyndell to Limgrave to leave the lands between by ship. At the end stretch of the Long March, Godfrey suppressed a rebellion of misbegotten that took place at Castle Morn. A misbegotten blacksmith and warrior named Hugh incited his kinfolk to revolt against the Golden Order, as his country of origin fell to ruin at Marika's hand, and his people were spurned from the Order. Hugh would be felled by Godfrey and taken as a hostage to the Round Table Hold, where he would serve as a slave blacksmith until the end of his days. Godfrey and his warriors traveled to their native land, the place that used to be known as the Highlands. Due to the power vacuum left by Godfrey's departure in the distant past, which caused chaotic disputes between barbarian warriors, as well as the geographic split that isolated the place, it earned the name Badlands. Godfrey would return to being a simple warrior, and using his old name, Horelu, he would reconquer his title of chieftain by waging an incessant war against the various barbarians of the Badlands, though he and his beast companion Zerosh would eventually be slain in battle. Following Godfrey's retirement, Radagon would abandon his wife Rennala and take his place as Marika's consort, becoming the second Elden Lord of the Golden Order. Upon leaving Rennala, he'd gift her the Great Rune of the Unborn, which was contained within an ember egg. What followed was a coup by the Academy against the Carian royal family, and Rennala was locked away at the Grand Library. There, she began to produce yet another batch of Albinorics, employing the ember egg in the hopes of producing a genuine female offspring of her and Radagon, as his red hair was stored within the egg. This marriage between Marika's two halves would produce two more Empyreans, Miquella and Melina. Both were cursed, one with eternal youth, the other with rot. Miquella would be deeply concerned for his sister, wishing to rid her of her blight. He experimented with Golden Order fundamentalism, but to no avail. He'd begin to develop a special substance to ward off the meddling of outer gods, unalloyed gold. But like all of Miquella's projects, this substance would never be completed, and its full potential wouldn't be achieved by him. After this Renaissance-like period, Marika would orchestrate two major events that would serve to reshape the world. She orders Ranni to steal a fragment of the Rune of Death to forge god-slaying weapons, as she herself couldn't go against her shadow, Maliketh. Shadows are beasts designed to serve as overseers to Empyreans, a measure to ensure that untrustworthy subjects won't betray the greater will. They are programmed to turn against their own conscience and act on their killing instinct alone, should their assigned Empyrean show signs of disloyalty. Ranni gifted Rykard a special stone engraved with a piece of the Rune of Death. He was to employ it against Maliketh, should he need to face the Beast of Destin's death one day. Then, she'd gift what remained of the fragments to Melina, and kill her Empyrean body to free her spirit from the influence of the greater will. Through a ritual that involved the death of Ranni's body, the Fingerslayer blade was forged. This blade could only be wielded by an Empyrean, as it had inherited Ranni's conductivity. Melina would later make use of it to slay her pair of fingers. On Marika's orders, Melina commanded the Black Knife Assassins, a group composed only of Numen women with close ties to Marika herself, and led them in a stealthy assault of Leyndell. Their objective was to slay the demigods of the Golden lineage and impair the Greater Will's influence. Godwyn the Golden was first to perish, the first of many martyrs to Marika's plan. A curse mark would be carved on his back at the moment of Ranni's corporeal death, causing the demise of his spirit. His body, which was buried at the foot of the Earth Tree, at Melina's birthplace, would cause the roots of the Earth Tree to be corrupted by the Rune of Death, halting their absorption of souls and birthing a new generation of those who live in death through the spread of Deathroot. Godwyn was the first of the demigods targeted for assassination for both thematic and narrative reasons. He was the firstborn of Marika and Godfrey, the first of the Golden lineage, as well as the first of the demigods to die. He was portrayed as the closest character Elden Ring's got to a pure, gold-hearted, powerful heroic figure, and unlike his younger twin brothers, he wasn't born afflicted with a curse. Godwyn's lack of character flaws made him deserving of the most tragic fate of all. This ties into the narrative reason for his assassination, which is that he was the perfect consort for Miquella. Miquella had been working to bring forth his age of kindness for a long time. He had watered a sapling with his blood, which grew into the Halig tree, the tree that would replace the Earth Tree as a conduit for the One Great. He'd been amassing forces to build an army that would rebel against the Golden Order. He was seen as the messiah of the meek and scorned. The Halig tree was perceived as a haven for them. An exodus of Albinorics, Misbegotten, and others took place, and they joined Miquella's forces. He promised them that he'd heal their curses and integrate them into his order, which would contemplate the entirety of existence. The Albinorics would be reborn and have their broken bodies fixed. The Misbegotten would be reborn and have their chimeric bodies restored. Those who live in death would be properly reintegrated into the natural cycle of death and rebirth, and so on. Like unalloyed gold, Miquella's divinity would ward off their curses. Miquella wanted a mighty, fitting consort to conquer the lands between, as Godfrey once did, as well as to produce a dynasty with, a new lineage of demigods. He made a vow with 3 suitable candidates: Godwyn, the first choice, Radahn, the second, and Mough, the third. And so, Miquella became the main enemy of Marika's conspiracy. Godwyn had to perish eventually, and it would be better if it happened sooner rather than later. After getting rid of her fingers, Melina wielded a fragment of the Rune of Death and became the Gloam-eyed Queen. She would flay the corpses of the felled demigods and sew their skin to create robes for the male scions, which earns them the Godskin title. She would also murder Iglay, the white serpent's deity, and extract its soul from underneath its skin to power the Godskins. This turns them into chimeric beings, not unlike those touched by the Crucible in the distant past. Melina would act as a motherly figure to the Godskins. Despite being raised motherless, she inherited Marika's nurturing traits. From the combination of the darkness of death and the Serpent's fire, Melina would create the Black Flame. Melina's role as the Gloam-eyed Queen will culminate in the burning of the Earth Tree. She stormed Leyndell once again and set the Earth Tree ablaze with her black flame, causing a rain of ash to fall upon the Golden Capital. As the interior of the Earth Tree, she slashed the belly of Metyr, the Mother of Fingers, crippling her fertility. Melina's attack would fail, however. It was her body which thoroughly burned into ash by her self-immolation with Destin's death. The Earth Tree survived. Malikev then commanded the Black Blade Kindred to hunt the conspirators. The Eternal City from which Melina hailed was invaded by them and would be brought to ruin. This is why we find various broken Black Blade Kindred at the nameless Eternal City, as well as a pair of valiant gargoyles at Siofra. This effort earned Malikev his infamous reputation as Death of the Demigods. Malikev had retrieved most of the stolen fragments of the Rune of Death. He proceeded to seal his sword within his body, so that it would never be stolen again. He'd go on to hide in Farum Azula, the most secret and distant place in all of the lands between. He'd occasionally live under the alias of Gurank, the beast clergyman, to gather death roots to eat, sealing the death imbued in the roots within himself. As punishment for their treason, the remaining scions of the Eternal Cities were banished to the deep underground, forced to live under a false night sky, and the Fingerslayer blade was stored within Nokron. Those of them who were fells during the event would be decapitated in death rites that aimed to appease the Deathbirds. The knights who served them were voluntarily beheaded, so that they could care for their masters even in death, and their spirits animated the mausoleums, which would wander around until exorcised by the Tarnished. Melina's spirit was imprisoned in a secret cell near the entrance to the Forbidden Lands. The Knight of the Black Knives was later perceived as a catalyst for the shattering of the Elden Ring by Marika, a major event that triggered the war among her offspring, and one of the final steps of her grand plan. After this incident, the Black Knife assassins were scorned and persecuted by the Golden Order. They'd find solace at the Haley Tree and swear their allegiance to Miquella. Some of them would serve as guards to the way gates to the Haley Tree at Ordina, Liturgical Town. Others served as assassins and would make an attempt on Ranni's life, following Miquella's orders in the future. Marika would go on to break the Elden Ring, an event that would be known as the Shattering, and that led to abandonment by the Greater Will. Each of her most important children inherited a shard of the Elden Ring, and their newfound strength would provoke a major war of succession to define who among them was deserving of the crown. Of course, this was all calculated by Marika. From the Knight of the Black Knives to the Shattering, she had managed to nearly eradicate her lineage of demigods, to incite all of the shard bearers to fight with each other, as well as causing the Greater Will to leave the planet. Marika's hammer is a special hammer crafted with stone, a material that rejects conductivity. This is why it was employed to shatter the Elden Ring. Marika's relation with the Numen customs is also demonstrated by her very plan to get rid of the influence of the Greater Will. The Numen used to craft special talismans that prevent status effects from building up. That is, talismans that ward off the influence of outer gods. As an aside, Marika's plan, which consisted of inciting her enemies to slaughter each other, is very typical of George R. R. Martin's writing. Countless works by George feature such a tactic, such as Men of Greywater Station and 7 Times Never Kill Men, arguably A Song of Ice and Fire, A Night at the Tarnhouse, and so on. As an example, I'll quote Dying of the Light, one of George's novels. Quote, "The son of the dreamer preached a creed of physical pacifism, but psychological aggression, and told his followers to resist their enemies with wit instead of force." End quote. Quote, "Remember, your enemy has an enemy." End quote. Quote, "Kimdis has fought no wars, but the world has bloody hands. When Tober in the Vale attacked Wolfheim, the manipulators supplied both sides. When civil war flared on Emerald between the Urbanites whose universe is a single building and the disaffected Starseekers who urged a broader horizon, Kimdis was deeply involved, giving the Urbanites the means to win conclusively." End quote. Quote, "It is said it was Kimdisi agents who set the Steel Angels and the Altered Men of Prometheus against each other, who deposed the 4th Kuchulain of Tara because he refused to trade with them, who interfered on Brachy to keep technology stillborn beneath the weight of the Brachy priests." End quote. All of these quotes came from one of George's works, but this type of scheme is a market trait of nearly all of them, and Marika has precisely inherited this prevalent philosophy and modus operandi. Marika's narrative role is also very similar to Velka's, the master manipulator behind the main events of the Dark Souls series of games. General Radahn and his army stormed the walls of Leyndell. He felt he was worthy of becoming the inheritor of the Elden Ring, and was inspired by his father Radagon's heroism as well as by his idol, the mighty conqueror Godfrey. His incredible performance in the war earned him the reputation of strongest among the demigods of the Shattering, and he kept fighting until the war's end, though it's worth mentioning that Morgoth was not widely recognized as a demigod, and Morgoth seemingly bested Radahn and managed to successfully defend Leyndell from the invaders. Radahn would also imprison the stars, so that his half-sister Ranni couldn't follow through with her plan, as her fate was tied to them. If their current stagnated, so would Ranni's fate. During Radahn's assault, Godric, a low-prestige member of the Golden lineage, whose royal blood was diluted to the point of irrelevancy, managed to infiltrate the Golden capital. He stole various treasures of Leyndell, a couple of them directly from Godwyn's stash, such as the ornate axe he wields, which belonged to Godwyn, and the pustule of the Prince of Death, which he'd attempts to graft onto himself to absorb some of Godwyn's strength. He also stole the Mimic Veil, and most importantly, the Anchor Rune of the Elden Ring. He made his escape by stealthily running away while wielding the powers of the Mimic Veil, hiding amongst the woman, and leaving behind an illusion of himself, who declared to be Godfrey the Grafted, as an homage to Godfrey, the warrior Godric most admired, to attract the attention of his pursuers. His double was bested and imprisoned in a never jail by a random knight of Leyndell named Christoph, and this feat earned him a nursery burial. As an aside, grafting, the special power of the Golden lineage, and of the Shamans of ages past, relates back to the golden sap which they consumed. The terminology is very deliberate. In the assault's aftermath, Godric fled to Castle Stormvale, the place where Godwyn used to lord over. As he felt Godwyn's pustule rejected his graft, he negligently threw it into the depths of the castle, a deed which brought a curse upon Stormvale. The very wind was afflicted with the blight of the Prince of Death, causing the walls that faced it to nearly crumble in a bizarre fashion. Rykard, the Praetor and Head Inquisitor, would eventually become infatuated with the idea of attaining power, as he was seduced by Iglay, the Serpent's deity. His noble ambition was corrupted, and he no longer opposed the Golden Order out of a duty to overthrow a corrupt system, but to enact the will of the greedy, all-consuming Serpent. Iglay, who had been slain and skinned by Melina to produce the Godskins, was reborn small and frail, and the charmed Rykard willingly fed himself to the Serpent, along with his Great Rune, as a way of restoring its might. Rykard and the Serpent were reborn as one. This new Rykard became increasingly cruel, ordering futile campaigns to fill his greedy aspirations. He would even go on to eat his own followers to acquire their might, with the end goal of consuming the entire world, transforming into an Ouroboros. The Devourer's Scepter, one of the legendary armaments, represents the end goal of the Great Serpent. It depicts the serpents devouring the entire world, and its Ash of War is a symbolic manifestation of that future, a red dome that steals the vigor of its targets. Rykard's role in the narrative fittingly serves as a parallel and continuation of Messmer's, the half-brother he looked up to. Messmer was cursed to be subsumed by the serpents as well, but was stopped by Marika. Rykard's greed festered, and no one placed a seal upon him. During the Shattering, Miquella would go to great lengths to attempt to revive Godwyn. For that, Miquella would order his followers to bring forth an eclipse from Castle Sol, a castle which too belongs to Godwyn, to intensify the connection between the spirit world and the physical, to revive Godwyn. He wanted to grant Godwyn a true death, so that either his soul, which was lost in a nightmare realm, or his body, which was gradually being corrupted by death, could be retrieved, and what would follow was a twofold plan. Miquella ordered Melina, his sworn blade and protector, to face Radahn, the last standing demigod of the Shattering, in battle, and steal his soul, so that it could be used to fill Godwyn's soulless body, in case Godwyn's soul was lost. He also charmed Mohg, and filled his head with visions of a Mohgwyn dynasty. A dynasty Mohg would rule, with Godwyn's soul within his body, in case Godwyn's body was lost. In the past, Miquella had seen Radahn's ample strength, and similarly to how Godfrey was chosen as the consort to Marika for his might, Radahn was chosen by Miquella as a candidate. Same with Mohg and Godwyn. Miquella's consort would act as a god of war of sorts, conquering the lands between for the age of their lord. Miquella's promise was made to the three brothers, which is why it was framed so ambiguously. Miquella fully inherited Marika's talent for manipulation, after all. During Melina's absence, Miquella let himself be captured by Mohg, whose essence as an Omen granted Miquella access to the banished realm of the Hornsent. He knew that Mohg would soon be challenged and bested by a Tarnished in battle. He would snatch Mohg's corpse subsequently. Miquella's spirit travels to the land of shadow, while his decayed body would be unresponsive to a bewitched Mohg's advances. There, he traveled to the Gate of Divinity, once used by his mother to attain godhood, discarding parts of himself along the way, including his feminine half, which manifested itself as Saint Trina, as to allow himself to become a true god, abandoning his fate and birthright as successor of the Golden Order in the process, and embrace his promised consort. Despite enacting the role of the master manipulator, Miquella is truly honest in his mission. He wants to bury the original sin, that is, the sinful rebirth of Marika, which involved so much suffering and human sacrifice, and become a god emperor, one that would rule for the benefit of all. He had promised the Albinorics he'd release them of their cursed bodies, and all of those that were scorned by the Golden Order that he'd incorporate them into his own order, which would be based upon kindness and love. His Elden Ring would be like a circle that engulfs all, removing free will, but filling its subjects with a deep sense of belonging. Despite being destined to fall continually, as his very curse foreshadows and denotes, he kept going. It's interesting to note how similar Miquella is to Marika. He appears to have inherited most prominently Marika's nurturing and caring traits, as well as her exceptional wit and charisma. He also seems to have inherited his father's loyalty to the Order, which he wanted not simply to restore, but to restructure, concluding his and his father's undertakings with fundamentalism and other experiments by achieving perfection. He also seems to be the only Empyrean that has inherited Marika's domain over his male and female halves. After being split from Miquella, Saint Trina began to wither away, her body turning into a flower in the process. In a way, this was an act of suicide and self-harm by Miquella, much like how he engaged in self-bloodletting to cultivate his sacred tree, and how he fed the Gate of Divinity parts of himself. Instead of committing a grave sin, sacrificing others to attain godhood, he sacrificed himself again and again. He was to be the second coming of the Messiah. Following the end of the Shattering, the events of the game begin. Marika had been imprisoned inside the Earth Tree by the Elden Beast, the spiritual half of Metyr, a vassal of the Greater Will and living incarnation of the concept of order. However, she had restored the grace of her past company of warriors, the Tarnished, and beckons them to return to the lands between to serve her one last time. They'd be instructed to hunt every contender to the throne, and finally become the next Elden Lord, as a means of ensuring that the next age would be ruled not by god emperors, who are vassals of the Greater Will, but by men who'd struggle for eternity to maintain their sovereignty. This is why Marika's grace bears the shape of humanity itself. Melina freed herself from her cell, with her jailer having rotted away, and the lands between having to deal with the results of the war. She managed to flee without consequences. She would serve the Tarnished as their maiden, granting them the strength of runes, and guiding them to the Round Table. Like her mothers, her quest was set to end in sacrifice, as she'd burn herself together with the Earth Tree once the Tarnished reached the kiln where the Giant's flame is stored. To be clear, Marika's plan was to purge the world of the direct influence of the Greater Will, granting sovereignty to mankind. This meant, of course, the death of every demigod, every child she ever birthed. Despite Marika's profound love for her sons and daughters, their very birth was a death sentence she herself would decree. This was all for the greater good, and she would endure the suffering alone, ultimately sacrificing herself to finally achieve her goal. The journey of the Tarnished culminates in her death. She aided them in any way she could, even tasking Hugh to produce the very weapon that would slay her. Now that I have explained most of the events that happened before and during the game, I will talk about the alternate endings. Ranni's plan of succession was devised to follow Marika's will. She'd collaborate with the Tarnished to finally end her Empyrean status, so that she couldn't be controlled by the Demiurge. This meant that she had to recover the Fingerslayer blade, the special blade which had been forged with her own Empyrean flesh. The Fingerslayer blade was stored within Nocron, which was sealed below the ground. Only by defeating Radahn could it be retrieved. And so, the Tarnished is tasked by Ranni with slaying him. Once the blade is given to Ranni, and her pair of fingers are killed, she is free to marry the Tarnished, who she believes will become the Elden Lord. And upon defeating Marika, Ranni is summoned and makes an honest vow to every creature, in which she tells of the hardships they will endure in the age to come, as they're alone and freed from the influence of any god. However, her vow doubles as a promise to Marika. She performs the vow while facing Marika's head and body, and it seems that the vow also serves to assure her deceased mother that she remains loyal to her. The Age of Stars is the conclusion of the plot of the Nox, who conspired against the Greater Will on Marika's orders and desires to produce a Lord of Night. We, the Tarnished, become that Lord. Miquella is aware of this and sends Black Knife assassins to kill Ranni and her associates, but to no avail. Fia, the Deathbed Companion, saw the suffering of those who live in death and was motivated to usurp the order for herself. The role she enacted as a Deathbed Companion, which was the sole purpose for her existence, serves as a microcosm for what her age represents. As a Deathbed Companion, she would grant her dead mates another chance at life. The Deathbed Companions are akin to sacred prostitutes, and the interaction they have with the champions who share with them their vigor is an euphemistic metaphor for sex, which is why Fia asks the Tarnished if they think it vulgar, and tells them as a disclaimer that it is a sacred act in her homeland. George's A Song of Ice and Fire includes sacred prostitution, and there it is a relevant world building and plot detail as well. Those who live in death are essentially spirits that were unable to be reborn, and so are cursed with returning to their decayed bodies for eternity. It follows that what Fia wants is to, as she herself puts it, be a mother to those who live in death. Under Fia's Age of the Duskborn, those who live in death will not be a scorned exception, but the rule. She wants everyone to be cursed with undeath, to mend the inequality and cease the persecution. Goldmask used to be a staunch Golden Order fundamentalist. He was critical of the hunters of those who live in death, lamenting that their learnedness had been reduced to fanatical raving and an obsession with finding a great evil to contend with, a concept which he did not believe existed within the Golden Order. As a Tarnished, he learns Radagon's true identity, that is, he learned that he is Marika's male half, which confirmed the doubts he had about the existence of one true god. He confirmed that as is above, so is below, that duality is a law. As Muriel, the pastor of Boughs, so elegantly puts it,
heresy is not native to the world. It is but a contrivance. All things can be conjoined.
Goldmask's ascetic epiphany is, simply put, that the world is perfect as it is. He embraces the dualistic nature of the world and seeks to preserve it, not leaving it open to the fickleness of gods and man. The mending rune of perfect order acts as a shield, a barrier that protects the Elden Ring from the flies which disturb it. The age of perfect order is one where the Elden Ring is left intact, untouched and undisturbed by the fickleness of man and God. Goldmask reached the logical conclusion of Golden Order fundamentalism with this discovery. One's soul resides within one's heart, and from it, it flows in the blood through one's body. The flow, most importantly, travels upward through one's brain, and then eyes, which is why the eyes act as windows to the soul. The seedbed curses are the hearts of those which have been ritualistically abused to death and left to rot by the Dung Eater. The murderous ritual performed by the Dung Eater involves the inversion of this process. He directs and extracts one's defiled soul through the anus. The defiled souls can't return to the Earth Tree, leaving them forever cursed. The Dung Eater then eats the hearts of his victims to absorb their curses, which is what earned him the name Dung Eater. And once again, in a display of the law of as above, so below, the ending proposed by the Dung Eater consists of cursing all souls of the world to roam as vengeful spirits, like those of the Hornsent. The world under the blessing of despair becomes a nightmare realm, not unlike that which afflicts the defiled souls of the Hornsent and of Godwyn. And lastly, I will talk about not only the ending of the Lord of the Frenzied Flame, but about the Three Fingers and their purpose as well. The two and three fingers were once part of one whole hand. A schism happened between the two halves of the hand, and so it was divided, both literally and figuratively. This schism parallels the birth of duality itself, the splitting of the one great, which was caused by its mind, the greater will. The two fingers have a duty to colonize the planets that bear life, and extract the life energy of the living to nurture the fractured one great, so that he can permanently grow. Think of a universe in constant expansion. The three fingers, however, wants to do the opposite, to melt the universe into one, ending duality, which they perceive as a mistake of creation, so that they can restore the wholeness of the one great. The three fingers are characterized by their desire for the collective, for becoming whole, which is why one becomes frenzied upon losing their individuality. Through the loss of oneself, which is often caused by intense suffering, the flame of frenzy is allowed to fester within, replacing the individual with the desire for the whole. Shabriri was the scholar and master mason responsible for the fifth generation of Albinaurics, the builders and sculptors who later became nomadic merchants. He was their father and teacher. Shabriri was such an exceptional sculptor that he was commissioned to build a statue of Radagon, the champion of the Golden Order himself. However, as he was sculpting Radagon, he discovered a forbidden truth. Radagon was Marika. Painfully burdened by that truth, he decided to, secretly, reveal it through his sculpture. But Marika eventually realized that Shabriri knew of her secret, and silenced him through punishment. His eyes were gouged out, a punishment symbolic of him having seen what he was not supposed to, though one that ironically emboldens the grasp of the frenzied flame. Shabriri's sons were left to suffer from a maddening disease, that is, from their deep sorrow. Marika then orders the collective punishment of their entire generation of Albinaurics, fearing the disease would fester and spread. They were accused of heretical beliefs, as they probably knew of Marika's secret, and could have spoken in defense of their father. They were buried alive, far underground, and there they chanted the curse of despair and summoned the flame of frenzy. Marika's collective punishment was a straw that broke the camel's back, and the frenzied flame was able to consume them.